Greetings and welcome to this week's episode of Bronx Bombers. My name is Joe Rubenstein and it is Wednesday, April 25th, and the Yankees are most definitely showing signs of life. Just a week ago, we were a 500 ball club and looked it, and today we sit 4 games over 500. And, maybe it was the cold weather, I have no idea, but we're starting to see this offense produce like we expected it to. And the scary thing for opposing pitchers, we're not even clicking on all cylinders yet. You can follow us on Twitter @BombersPodcast is the handle. You can also send us questions. We'll try to answer each and every week in our mailbag segment here on the podcast. You can like us on Facebook, subscribe to our show on iTunes or Stitcher. You can also drop us a line, 646-854-4959. And as always, you can send your comments and questions to joe@BronxBombersPodcast.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. Coming up a little bit later on in our Twitter poll this week, some interesting results when we asked whether the Yankees should pursue Manny Machado or starting pitching. And Jonathan Eig, author of Opening Day, the story of Jackie Robinson's first season, will be rejoining the show for part 2 of our conversation. Also, I'll answer a fascinating question from one of our followers about the biggest surprise so far this season. And I'll recap the last week, which featured a nice series win over Toronto at home and a couple of nice wins against Minnesota as well. We'll go through the good, the bad, and the ugly from these last few games. All that and more coming up on today's Bronx Bombers. Back in a moment.
Bronx Bombers Trivia. Mariano Rivera was the last Yankee pitcher to be named Most Valuable Player in a World Series. Who was the first? Was it A, Bob Turley, B, Whitey Ford, C, Don Larson, or D, John Wetland? The answer coming up a little bit later in the podcast.
And now here's Joe with this week's main thing.
This is the first week since the regular season began that I've felt really good about this team. There's still questions and causes for concern. There always will be. The defense remains a problem. 4 errors in that game last night. You just cannot give away outs like that. But I think it's entirely possible that Blue Jays series, in which we took 3 out of 4, scoring 23 runs, was a turning point. You could see Stanton's at-bats getting better, still too many strikeouts, but on Monday he really broke out against Minnesota, reaching base all 5 times he came to the plate, which he's only done 7 times in his 9-year career, a walk and 4 hits, including a monster shot into the left field seats. He wasn't so good last night, so it's kind of a step forward and a step back for Stanton, but the boos have certainly tapered off from the Bronx, and I have a feeling that little hazing ritual that fans at Yankee Stadium have been subjecting him to, I think those days are numbered. And as we speak, the Yankees are leading the majors in runs scored with an incredible 6.1 per game, leading the league in home runs with 36. That's 6 home runs ahead of the pace of the 1997 Mariners, who hold the record for most home runs in a season with 264. The Yankees lead the league in OPS, that's on-base percentage plus slugging, at .814. And on that happy note, let's dive right into the good, the bad, and the ugly as we take a hard look at some of the individual performances of the past week, a week that featured a fair amount of ground gained on Toronto and Boston. And unlike last week, where the good section had only one player, Aaron Judge, this week we have a few more to speak of, quite a few more. But we must begin with this week's headliner, and I have a feeling he'll be making this section quite a bit in the future, young Miguel Andujar, who, after a bit of a slow start, is committing acts of major mayhem on opposing pitchers. And it's still early, but what this kid is doing right now reminds me of what Aaron Judge was doing around this time last year. Andujar, simply put, has been one of the very best offensive performers in the American League this past week, and is a big reason why we currently sit on top of the offensive leaderboards. And here are the numbers for Miguel just this past week. He's hitting .524, 11 hits and 21 at-bats, 5 doubles, 3 home runs, 5 runs scored, and 7 RBIs. In just 1 week, he has lifted his batting average from 107 to 316. and he's looked great defensively. So Brandon Drury, who has made strides apparently in recovering from his blurred vision, may have been Wally pipped here, because it doesn't take an Einstein to figure out that this Andujar cannot be taken out of the lineup, not while he's hitting like this. And the reporting is, interestingly enough, that the reason why Brian Cashman passed on a trade for Garrett Cole this winter is the Pirates were insisting on Miguel Andujar as part of that deal. So good for Cashman. Now Cole has pitched well, although he did lose at home to the Angels on Monday night, outpitched by Tyler Skaggs. But this Andujar is obviously a special talent and could very well be part of the Rookie of the Year conversation if he keeps this up. And he had plenty of company this week as far as offensive production. Didi, who I'll discuss in greater depth later in this podcast, he's a boss. Didi now leads the majors in slugging at .746, and he is the first shortstop in Major League history with at least 8 home runs and 27 RBIs in his team's first 22 games. Think about that, 27 RBIs in April. And April is not even over yet. And, 100 RBIs is a great season. He's over a quarter of the way there on April 25th. He's currently on pace to hit 59 home runs and 199 RBIs. Not saying he's going to do it, but that's just how hot he's been. Aaron Judge continues to amaze. 3 hits last night, including a monster shot into the right field seats. Judge now leads the American League with an incredible .476 on-base percentage. That's Ted Williams territory. Also leads the league in walks with 20. Just in the last week he had 7, along with 3 home runs this past week and 2 doubles. Judge's season average stands at .341. And another member of our good section is Gary Sanchez. Gary with 2 bombs last night. The only player in Major League history with 9 multi-home run games in his first 200 career games. And Gary Sanchez in the last week with 2 home runs, 2 doubles, and 5 RBIs. The 4th member of our good section is Tyler Austin, who after his fight in Boston has kind of become a fan favorite and could very well force Greg Bird to earn back his job. Austin, in his last 9 games, is hitting .371 with an on-base of .450, 6 runs, 4 doubles, 2 home runs, 4 walks, and 10 RBIs. So another of our homegrown boys is making good. Now, why Boone decided to start Neil Walker last night, I have no idea, especially given the fact that Austin will have to face a suspension soon, and Walker was just terrible. 2 strikeouts and a just egregious error. All 4 of our pitchers not named Sonny Gray make my good list this week as well. Luis Severino, who held the Blue Jays, a good hitting team, to just 3 hits over 7 innings. Mr. Masahiro Tanaka, who was very sharp, as sharp as we've seen him all year against the Twins on Monday, dominating in fact. Tanaka also gave us badly needed length. Sabathia last night, just a master at generating weak ground ball contact. Just put those Minnesota bats to sleep. Stopped Brian Dozier's 24-game hitting streak. So you get good starting pitching, you win ball games, right? And with Boston losing 2 over the weekend, idle on Monday and losing again last night, the Yankees, powered by excellent starts by Montgomery, Severino, Tanaka, and Sabathia, gained a full 3.5 games in the standings in just 4 days, and now sit only 4 games out of first place. In the bad section this week, unfortunately, is a player I like, Brett Gardner. Gardy's just in a cold spell, and to make matters worse, he made a really dumb defensive play on Saturday against the Blue Jays. It's a game we won. So here's what happened. Randall Grichuk opened the top of the 5th with a walk, and then Lourdes Gurriel, the younger brother of Yuli Gurriel of the Astros, had a sharp single to left field. Gardner threw a relay to Andujar at third. Why? I have no idea. Grichuk was in easily. Also, the throw was like 15 feet off the bag, which gave Gurriel the opportunity to advance into scoring position, which he did. What Gardy should have done is hit Didi as his cutoff guy and let Didi make the call as far as which base to throw to. Now, that second run didn't score, but it's the kind of move the Yankees have to cut down on. The Yankees, again, with 4 errors last night, and that was a bonehead play by Gardner, who just hasn't been hitting. This past week, just hitting 111. He does have 5 walks, so that's good, but Gardy needs to pick it up. And speaking of outfielders, we had some good news on Clint Frazier this week, who suffered a concussion concussion early in spring training after crashing into an outfield wall. He played 5 innings in a game on Monday and had no ill effects, no symptoms. So that's some more depth that could be on the way very soon. And Billy McKinney, who sprained his shoulder in that first series in Toronto, has also been fielding fly balls and grounders at the stadium. So he could be a couple of weeks away as well. So better play and a return to good health has made for a nice week in Yankee land, except for our second member of the bad section, a guy I've raked over the coals quite a bit, as recently as last week, in fact, Mr. Betances, who came into a 5-1 game last night and proceeded to throw 6 straight balls, most of them way, way off the plate, and with a runner on first attempted a pickoff. The ball sailed way over Neil Walker's head, and here we go again, we're off and running with Mr. Betances. Another walk, a single and a run later, Betances is booed off the mound, and I said this on Twitter, with a couple of guys in the pen, like Jonathan Holder and Chasen Shreve throwing pretty well, he cannot be our primary option in the 7th inning of a close game. He cannot. He is simply not reliable. And speaking of unreliable, we must conclude with our ugly section. But before we do, let's hand out a runner-up to our good section. A runner-up this week is Ronald Torreyes, whose ability as a contact hitter continues to amaze. Before Gleyber Torres was called up, Torreyes was playing second base daily, and Ronald's numbers were great, going 5 for 10 with a walk and an RBI. But with the call-up of Gleyber Torres, Torreyes is back to his role as super utility guy. And the word on Gleyber is that he's really a better version of Torreyes, a better fielder and the same kind of hitter, a contact hitter, which I love. Uses the whole field, does not miss pitches he should hit, and he can hit velocity. We saw it last night, and he has developing power, which Torreyes does not. Just an all-around really good baseball player, a complete player at the age of 21, and he's the youngest position player to play for the Yankees since Melky Cabrera back in 2005, and the second youngest player in the majors this season. Now, our ugly section has one headliner, and it's a repeat performer, as he headlined this section last week, and that is Sonny Gray, who was truly abysmal in his start on Friday night against the Blue Jays, our only loss in that series. You know, we heard talk leading into that game about mechanical adjustments, we heard talk about working more quickly, we heard talk about trusting his stuff. Nothing worked. He fell behind batter after batter, constantly nibbling around the zone, nibble, 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 like a freaking goldfish. His velocity is, again, nowhere near what it needs to be. The final line on Sonny Gray, 5 runs, 5 hits, and 4 walks in a grand total of 3.5 innings. Again, this guy is giving us nothing, and his ERA is an obese 8.27 after 4 miserable starts. You know, after the game he talked about the weather. I don't want to hear about the weather anymore. Not for another second. Enough with the weather already. Everybody's been pitching in crappy weather. And, you know, people talk about how he pitches better with Romine behind the plate. And, I just heard that Romine is catching him tonight against Minnesota. And look, I like Romine, but you're telling me every 5 days we have to replace a hitter with the explosive skill set of a Gary Sanchez with Austin Romine? Why? Why is it that our other 4 starters can throw 4 beauties in a row to Sanchez, but this guy just can't? I don't know what his problem is, but he better figure it out fast, like tonight fast. And I'll be honest, I don't even want to watch the game when he pitches. It's painful. It's not enough that he's awful. There's plenty of pitchers that are awful. It's just that he's awful twice as slow as anybody else. You could write a short novel in the time he takes between pitches. He looks like he doesn't even want to be there, frankly. And if he stinks up the joint tonight again, you know, the boo birds and the bleacher creatures are going to have a brand new target. In fact, he was booed off the mound on Friday night. He's the fly in the ointment right now. And, you know, we've had championship teams with one pitcher performing badly like this. You know, back in 96, Kenny Rogers was a free agent that we picked up from Texas. And, you know, he was terrible all year. In fact, that famous Leyritz home run in the 96 World Series, the reason we needed that 3-run shot to get us back in the game was a horrendous start by Kenny Rogers. But, you know, it's far from ideal. And look, there's nothing to do about it now, right? I mean, teams just aren't ready to deal away pitchers in April. But personally, I don't hold out a lot of hope that he's going to improve. And I hope we can package him in some kind of a deal in July so we don't have to look at this anymore. Because frankly, his starts this season have been an abomination. Back in a moment. All right, back here on Bronx Bombers, and our featured guest once again is Jonathan Eig, author of Opening Day, the story of Jackie Robinson's first season. Jonathan's here with us for part 2 of our conversation, which we begin with a question about Ben Chapman. Now, Ben Chapman is sort of a notorious figure in the history of this 47 season as the ringleader of some vicious racist heckling of Robinson. Chapman was the Alabama-born manager of the Phillies. He'd come up with the Yankees, actually, as a player in the 30s, but manager Ben Chapman and his Phillies did not distinguish themselves on their first visit to Ebbets Field that season. Describe what happened there, and I'm particularly interested in the aftermath, the press reaction, and how that may have changed the equation as far as the public's attitude towards Jackie and the integration of baseball.
The great irony is that Ben Chapman may have ended up doing Robinson a favor. I think Chapman was a jerk. He was a cretin. He was also he was prejudiced, but he also believed that there was a competitive advantage to intimidate and to harass people. Kind of the same way Ty Cobb or Muhammad Ali would try to get under their opponent's skin. And when the Phillies came to Brooklyn for the first time, Chapman just right away wanted to see if he could push Robinson over the edge. He began calling him all kinds of names, the N-word most prominently, telling him to go back to the cotton fields that he came from, and just trying to see if he could get Robinson to explode, to take the bait, and to lash out and get himself thrown out of the game, or maybe even get himself thrown in jail for starting a fight. And Robinson didn't take the bait, but what happened was that fans who maybe had never even thought about what Robinson really had to go through, fans who weren't white fans, who were not sensitized to this, saw it happening and thought, oh my God, that's outrageous, that's hideous behavior. And Robinson may not have been white, but he was a Dodger, and for Dodger fans, that counted for something. And they began. I talked to a kid who was at that game, and said that he had never even occurred to him that anybody would call Robinson names. And it was this huge epiphany for him, like, oh my God, black people in this country have a really hard time. They really get picked on, and he had never witnessed it before. So it was a culturally eye-opening moment for a lot of people.
So there were 2 other incidents, one involving the St. Louis Cardinals in Brooklyn, and the other supposedly taking place in Cincinnati. Now, whether they happened the way they were portrayed is another story, but let's take them one at a time. The first, which got a huge amount of national press, was a supposed push by a number of Cardinals players to boycott their first game against the Dodgers rather than play on the same field as Robinson. So, Jonathan, what were you able to come up with as far as what actually happened there? And again, what was the nature of the press coverage afterwards?
Yeah, there were stories that went around suggesting that players were trying to organize a league-wide boycott, that if players all over the league refused to take the field when Robinson came to town, then they would have to get rid of Robinson. And it's really hard to tell whether this was just gossip in the locker room, like, hey, talking trash, or whether it actually went anywhere and amounted to a serious threat. I found only one newspaper account that suggested that this was a serious threat, but it wasn't until afterwards, and it wasn't very well corroborated. My hunch is that it was just a bunch of guys talking trash, and that it never got off the ground. But nevertheless, it's an indication of just how uncomfortable people were, and how many players were still really on the fence about this. These guys were in the same situation that that Bobby Bragan and Dixie Walker were in. They really they saw this as a threat to not just to the game that they knew as they knew it, but a threat to all of their ideals. Their very concept of what it meant to be black and white in America was under attack with Robinson.
Now, the second incident did or did not take place at Crossleaf Field in Cincinnati a little later in the season. The legend goes that Robinson was subjected to racial abuse during a game, and that shortstop Pee Wee Reese went over and put his arm around Robinson's shoulders, and that was like a turning point both for the Dodger players and in general as far as Robinson's acceptance. It's even been trumpeted as a turning point in race relations in general in this country. But give us some of the background on the supposed incident involving Reese. Was this incident and the apparent friendship between Robinson and Reese a total fabrication? And if so, how did this legend become fact?
Oh man, I could talk for an hour like deconstructing it and explaining how it began. The story goes that Robinson was in Cincinnati and that Pee Wee Reese put his arm around Jack to say to the hecklers, "Hey, cut it out. He's one of us." And there's a statue that shows this moment. There's a children's book written about it, but it didn't happen in 1947. There's no evidence whatsoever to suggest that it happened in 1947. The coverage from that game where it supposedly happened, black and white newspapers all said that Robinson was treated well by the crowds that day, and nobody mentioned such an incident. But I think what happened is like a year later, Robinson was playing second base. The first season Robinson played first base. So Robinson played second base and Pee Wee was at shortstop. And, in between innings or, during pitching changes, they would huddle together and Pee Wee would put his arm around Jackie. And people saw that. And maybe even sometimes there were some hecklers and Pee Wee, made a point of putting his arm around Jackie. So it happened, occasionally over the years. And I think some writer decided that it would make the story cooler if they put that gesture back in 1947 and made it a real key to Jackie's acceptance. And it was just some writer, I won't name any names, but I have a couple of possible suspects, who decided that the story would sound better if we placed it in 1947 and placed it in Louisville. In Cincinnati, which is near Pee Wee's hometown. And I think that's how it got started. And then over the years, it just got repeated and repeated until it became like a myth.
Now, Jackie in 1947 was playing first base, which he'd never played before. The Dodgers at that point already had a second baseman, Eddie Stanky. And Robinson had a tough first couple of months that season, particularly at the plate. There was even some debate, at least in the press, that he might be sent down to the minors. Certainly he was very concerned about it. Give us a sense of Robinson's athletic performance those first couple of months of the 1947 season.
Yeah, it was clear that he had a lot of talent physically. He was great on the bases, but he was learning a new position at first base, and he was trying to hit major league pitching after only a year in the minors and not having really been focused on baseball even as a college student. So he had a steep learning curve, and he didn't have a good arm. He had a kind of an awkward swing. He didn't look good at times. And a lot of people thought that maybe Branch Rickey had just chosen the wrong athlete, that Robinson wasn't cut out for it. But after a bit of a sluggish start, he began to hit. And when he got on base, he was so scary on the base paths that all the players around him in the lineup began to hit better too, because if you're hitting behind Robinson's on base, you're going to see a lot more fastballs because the pitcher's going to be nervous about Robinson taking off, stealing. So it became clear after just maybe a month or maybe 2 months that he was really going to make it as a player and that he was making the team a lot better. And once the players began to see that they had a chance at the World Series, that this guy was really making the team better, that's when the attitudes began to shift. Winning, cures everything. And once these guys could start to smell that World Series money, they began to find that they could put up with a lot more than they thought they could put up when it came to their views on race.
Now, 1947 was an interesting year in the major leagues, especially in the National League. There wasn't really one dominant team. There were three teams sort of bunched up together at the top of the standings, the Dodgers, the Cardinals, and the Braves. And in the American League, the reigning champion Red Sox were faltering. And the Yankees, although good, had their own problems with a less than healthy Joe DiMaggio and some pitching issues as well. But with the Dodgers, generally speaking, what were their team strengths and weaknesses that year? And how much of a role did Jackie Robinson's increasingly excellent performance play in winning them the National League pennant?
I think Robinson was the MVP of that team. He made everybody else better, and you look at how many players in that lineup had career years at the plate. It was because Robinson was upsetting so many pitchers. I mean, every time he was on base, the pitchers couldn't concentrate, had to hold him on. He was taking extra bases. He was taking big turns. He just changed everything, and he was getting on base and driving up RBI totals for everybody behind him in the lineup. This was not a legendary team by any stretch. They had, other than Robinson, I'm going to go on a limb here. I don't know this for sure, but I don't think they had any other Hall of Famers on that team. Pee Wee Reese, but he was even, some would say a borderline Hall of Famer. But this was this was a team that was not going to be a dynasty by any stretch, and that, of course, the Dodgers had never won the series, and they were a team of upstarts, and I think Robinson was the key to their success.
Now, the Yankees, whatever their vulnerabilities that year, were catapulted to the AL pennant on the strength of a 19-game winning streak in July. DiMaggio, although he never quite regained his pre-war form, ended up having another good season, and hard-throwing reliever Joe Page had a pivotal role on that team as well. And the Yankees were certainly favorites in the World Series against the Dodgers, but it was a series that turned out to be highly competitive, going the full 7 games. Talk about any rivalry that may have existed between these two clubs, who had only met in the series for the first time 6 years earlier in 1941, and what the expectations were heading into the series, the first to be televised, by the way.
Yeah, first televised, and it was, of course, a Subway Series. You had the great rivalries of Brooklyn and the Bronx, Yankee fans and Dodger fans, and Yankee fans, of course, having been spoiled over the years by the great success, and the Dodger fans as the upstarts, the punks who had never won it all, and that made for a great rivalry. And you had the Yankees with seemingly a far greater, more powerful lineup. And the Dodgers giving them everything they had. It was a really fun up and down World Series with a lot of drama. But, Jackie did not have a great World Series. He had a couple of exciting moments on the bases, but he did not have a great World Series. And I don't know if he was just burned out from a long season of stress, but it was a tough one for him, I think.
That 47 series is best remembered for a pinch hit by Dodger Cookie Lavagetto, which broke up Bill Bevan's no-hitter with 2 outs in the 9th inning of Game 4 and won that game for Brooklyn. But the Dodgers went on to lose in 7 to the Yankees, a team they would lose to 3 more times before extracting some revenge in 1955, winning that series in 7. But that year, 55, was the year that Robinson really slowed down as a player, a variety of injuries and ailments. And in 1956, he famously rejected a trade to the Giants, retired from baseball, and went on to a career as an executive. Final question, talk about Jackie's involvement with the civil rights struggle as it started to really take shape after his retirement in 1956, how that evolved, and how you feel about Jackie's ultimate legacy.
Robinson was always a fiercely independent guy, and I think he deserves a lot of credit. Martin Luther King Jr. said that before there were sit-ins, Jackie Robinson was leading the sit-ins. Before there were marches, Jackie Robinson was leading the marches. That Robinson in many ways made it possible for the civil rights activists to come along and do what they did. But Robinson never quite fit in. He did volunteer with King, and he did get involved in some of the protests in the South, and he did use his clout to speak up, but he also grew increasingly conservative and crusty in some ways. Maybe he felt resentful that he wasn't appreciated, or that he had to put up with as much as he did put up with in his youth, and didn't have the support around him that King and others would have in the 60s. So I think you see Robinson becoming more conservative politically, supporting Rockefeller, supporting Nixon. He was a complicated guy to figure out. I think he always liked to be difficult. He liked to be the contrarian. But what's clear throughout is that he felt very strongly about about politics. He felt very strongly about being involved. He wanted to be on the front lines. He wanted to fight for change, and was willing to sacrifice his health and his even risk his life to do that over the years.
Opening Day. Pick it up. It's not only an important story, but it happens to be an incredibly entertaining book filled with fascinating stories well told and subplots that we just didn't have time to cover today. Jonathan, thank you so much for being part of the show once again. We really appreciate it.
Anytime. Thanks again.
All right, we'll come back. More Bronx Bombers in just a moment.
And now the answer to today's Bronx Bombers trivia question. Who was the first Yankee pitcher to be named Most Valuable Player in a World Series? The answer? C. Don Larson. And now here's Joe with this week's Twitter poll.
Yes, this week's Twitter poll results are in. We asked you this. Which should the Yankees focus on acquiring this coming off season? Manny Machado or starting pitching? And 67% of our followers on Twitter @BombersPodcast said starting pitching. Only 9% said Manny Machado, that kind of surprised me, and 24% said both, no matter what the cost. So just some numbers on Machado. After a slow start, he's caught fire. 2 home runs on Sunday off of Kluber. That's not easy to do. And Manny, playing his natural position of shortstop this season. Showalter has light-hitting Tim Beckham playing third, who's just hitting 179. The Orioles are just awful, by the way, as I predicted. Actually, worse than I predicted. They're not even hitting other than Manny. Second baseman Jonathan Scope hitting just 225. First baseman Chris Davis 164. But Machado now has 8 home runs, so 2 behind Mike Trout for the lead in the American League. Trout is on fire. Manny's hitting 360, on-base percentage 447, 17 RBIs, OPS at 1154. But here's the thing, and this is reason number 1 why I'm with the 67% that say rather than pursue Machado, the Yankees should go after starting pitching this offseason, or maybe even sooner. There's another shortstop in the American League. He's hitting 347 with 27 RBIs. That's tops in the majors, and 10 more than Manny. 8 home runs, same as Manny, and a Ruthian OPS of 1229. That's a full 75 points higher than that of Manny Machado, and that shortstop is our very own Didi Gregorius, who, at a salary this season of $8.5 million, is earning just over half of what Manny's earning, and Machado is going to be earning a lot more than that annually a year from now, wherever he ends up. Look, Manny's a great player, and he's only 25, so just entering his prime years. Some team is going to get themselves a great shortstop, but Didi is not exactly an old man. He just turned 28. And if Andujar continues to develop and grow before our eyes here, I mean, check this out. The most extra base hits by a Yankee in their first 19 career games is 16, by a guy named Joe DiMaggio. Andujar's 14 is the second most in the entire history of the New York Yankees. And that's nice company, Joe DiMaggio. So another infielder is just not a glaring need on this ball club, and starting pitching most definitely is. We essentially have one ace in Severino. We've got a guy who's kind of running on fumes in Sabathia, and a guy in Sonny Gray who's a disaster in slow motion. We'll see how he does tonight against Minnesota. Lance Lynn is starting for them. He's been almost as bad as Gray, which is saying a mouthful. Now, who the Yankees pursue after the season ends is an open question, and I'm sure that's going to be a major topic of conversation over the next few months. And on this podcast, there are some really good pitchers that are going to be unrestricted free agents in 2019, headlined by Clayton Kershaw and Dallas Keuchel. But there are a few others who have good numbers who might cost a good deal less. Patrick Corbin of the Diamondbacks among them, 1.89 ERA so far this year, better than Kershaw or Keuchel. And Corbin, who's only 28, so younger than Kershaw and Keuchel, and from New York, was just interviewed the other day by Bob Nightingale, baseball writer for USA Today. And this is what Patrick Corbin said to Bob Nightingale, quote, "It would definitely be great to play in New York. I grew up a Yankee fan. Really, every generation of my family has been Yankee fans. I know the Yankees have had some interest in the past. There were a lot of rumors this winter that got my family really excited. It would have been cool," unquote. So that sounds like mutual interest to me. And one other guy I'd take a hard look at if I was Brian Cashman is Hyunjin Ryu of the Dodgers, who outpitched Steven Strasburg over the weekend and has had a dominating year so far, 4-0 with a 1.99 ERA, opponents batting just 141 against Ryu, but he's 31, so you got to be careful. But as I said earlier in this podcast, there could be a deal or two made during the season for pitching. And if you look at championship teams, they tend to have not one but two aces. Houston last year had Verlander and Keuchel. The Yankees in the past had Wells and Cone, and then Clemens and Cone. In my childhood, they had Guidry and Catfish Hunter. If you have two top guys, it suddenly becomes a whole lot easier to flesh out the rest of that rotation. And right now, the Yankees have one top guy. They need that second ace, I think, to put them over the top. And if it was up to me, that would be the Yankees' number one priority this offseason. And as far as the 24% that said go after both, that is Machado and starting pitching, no matter the cost, it's tempting to say that. You know, it's not our money, right? And the Yankees are a very wealthy organization. But don't forget the problems that this approach has caused for us in the past, having to wait out contracts contracts like the A-Rod contract and the Teixeira contract during their late unproductive years, and especially now with that luxury tax penalty if you go over that threshold, you don't want to get bogged down owing a slew of aging veterans a ton of money for years to come while simultaneously having to pay that tax. It ties you up, and it's what the Red Sox are going to be facing a year from now, and believe me, it's not going to be pretty. Well, not for them at least. I'm going to enjoy it. All right, from this week's mailbag, our question of the week here on Bronx Bombers comes from Bill in Manchester, New Hampshire. And by the way, the email is joe@bronxbomberspodcast.com, or you can find us on Twitter @BombersPodcast is the handle, or leave us a message at 646-854-4959. If you have any questions you want to have us answer on any future episodes, we are more than happy to do so. And Bill writes, I'm a lifelong Braves fan, 83 years young, going back to when they played in Boston. My grandson sent me your National League preview from last month, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I have two questions. What surprised you the most so far this season, and do my Braves have a shot? That's a great question, or pair of questions, but how about the team loyalty on Bill? I mean, here's a New England guy, goes all the way back to when the Braves were in Boston, never won a thing in Bill's lifetime. Only world title the Braves ever won in Boston was in 1914. They moved to Milwaukee in 53. Bill sticks with it, gets some satisfaction when they beat the Yankees in 57. That was the first of 4 Yankees-Braves World Series matchups and the only one that the Braves won. Then they moved to Atlanta. Bill continues to stick with it from up there in New Hampshire. His loyalty gets rewarded in 95. That is team loyalty, man. I mean, the Red Sox had some good teams in Bill's lifetime, but Bill's a Braves guy, and end of story. They could move to the moon, still a Braves guy. So well done, Bill. But as far as surprises, certainly a handful of teams I picked as division winners who have looked less than stellar out of the gate, including the Dodgers, who just are not hitting without Justin Turner in that lineup. He broke his wrist back in spring training, probably returns in mid-May. But remember, the Dodgers started 10-12 last year and made it to Game 7 of the World Series, okay? The Cubs have struggled a bit as well. The pitching has not been there. Jose Quintana's been absolutely awful, as bad as Gray, which is saying something. And Darvish, his ERA is near 7, and the Cubs currently sit in 4th place behind the Cardinals, who are red hot right now, the Brewers and the Pirates, who are sinking rapidly after getting swept by the Phillies over the weekend. And the Nationals, another team that I picked to win the division, also sit in 4th place, 2 games under 500, 5 games behind the Mets, who started red hot, but they're showing some holes now, especially their bullpen. And Cespedes, man, he's had a couple of big hits, including a game winner in Washington, but hitting just 195 with a whopping 37 strikeouts, 6 more than Stanton. So that's elite level whiffing right there. And in 3rd place in the National League East are Bill's Braves, who have shown some moxie. More than that, they're a good team. Freddie Freeman hitting 300, already has 15 RBIs. The Braves are actually the 5th best hitting team in the majors right now, behind the Yankees, the Red Sox, the A's, and the Cubs. So the Braves, who had 0 expectations heading into the season, have the 2nd best offense right now in the National League. So Bill, my friend, the Braves are absolutely in the running for a wild card spot, maybe even the division. The pitching has been solid as well, 3rd best team ERA in the National League, but they have some stiff competition because another surprise, not a total surprise, but still a surprise, are the Phillies. And I picked both of these teams, the Braves and the Phillies, to go over the Vegas line. In fact, I picked the Phillies to go well over. Vegas had them at 75.5 wins. That's a losing season. I picked them for 81 wins. I'm looking at how well they're playing, and that's without Carlos Santana really hitting yet. Like a lot of big free agent sluggers, especially those that have changed leagues, he's been awful, hitting just 151. Evan Longoria on the Giants also changed leagues. He's been picking it up lately, but still only 2 home runs, hitting just 243. But my pick of 81 wins would make the Phillies a 500 ball club. But right now, they're at a 667 winning percentage, and in a fight with the Mets for the top spot in the National League East. And I'd say, in addition to the Braves, Bill, the Phillies are the biggest surprise. I expected them to move forward, especially after they acquired Arrieta right at the end of spring training. entertaining, but not this quickly. I mean, the Phillies have won 12 of their last 15, including an 8-1 record at Citizens Bank Park. Manager Gabe Kapler, after some early bad press and bad fan reaction, has quickly gained people's trust. And with some solid pitching from Arrieta, who's looked very good, 2.04 ERA, Aaron Nola and Nick Pivetta also look good. I'd have to say, Bill, that the Phillies are my biggest surprise so far, but your Braves are right behind them. And like the Yankees, the Braves have an unbelievable farm system, the best in the majors, actually. And both the Braves and the Yankees, with all this young talent, I mean, the Yankees on Sunday fielded an all-under-30 team for the first time since World War II, I believe. Both these teams are going to be a lot of fun to watch for the next few years. So thanks for that question, Bill. And good luck to your Braves, except when they play the Yankees, of course. And that'll do it for this week's episode of Bronx Bombers. Again, don't forget, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or Stitcher, and please do follow us on Twitter @BombersPodcast is the handle. Like us on Facebook as well, but most of all, have faith in the Yankees. We'll see you again next week.